All right, well, that is our cue to get started with the webinar. So first of all, I just want to say good morning again. And on behalf of David's entire team, thank you so much for coming and spending this time with us today. David has some really powerful content to share today about trauma and its impact on our leadership. And as always, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on David's YouTube channel following the presentation, which I will post the link to the channel in the chat room so you can all go back and watch it again or share it with your friends and colleagues. As many of you already know, David has more than 35 years of experience as a family therapist, workshop facilitator, lecturer, and advisor to leadership executives all over the world. He is a best-selling author and respected thought leader in our leadership community. He is incredibly passionate about helping people connect with the most authentic versions of themselves and seeing the world transform one authentic person at a time. Whether he's leading an academy, hosting a webinar, speaking in front of a crowd, or sharing his thoughts through his written words, David is inspired and fulfilled by the work he does. So thank you again to you all for joining us this morning. It's so inspiring, encouraging, and just wonderful to see so many leaders who are committed to learning and growing and showing up as the most authentic versions of themselves. That all trickles down to our communities, our workplaces in just such an impactful way. So without further ado, here is David.
Thank you, Kristen. I was just saying to Kristen before we started, I always feel a little more relaxed when Kristen's here, sort of handling all those backstage responsibilities. So Kristen, I always value your energy and your passion, and thanks for kicking this thing off. Well, folks, I appreciate very much you joining me this morning, joining our community this morning. Here's how the thing goes. The deal is that I'll speak for about an hour, and you are welcome to leave your videos off. We've purposefully muted everyone during this first hour just for all of our sanity, to keep all the background noise done. So I'm going to talk for an hour, and then I stay on for an extra half an hour. If you can only stay for an hour, no problem. It will be recorded. So feel free to jump off on the hour or any time that you wish. And feel free also to be a part of our community. I invite people to the recording will stop on the hour, and then we have a half an hour of dialogue, questions and answers. So this is a topic that feels like I'm a little more nervous than usual presenting on this topic. It is a topic I have never formally presented on. It feels a little risky because trauma can mean so many things to so many people. So let me share with you a little bit about me, about where the interest of this came from this morning. And then I want to talk about what you can expect in the next hour and what this won't be about for the next hour. So first of all, my background, as Kristen introduced me, many of you know, I'm trained as a family therapist. I was a family therapist in the 1980s in Lethbridge. I had my own practice, saw troubled families for 10 years. You can't be in family therapy and not experience people who come in trauma. So it's something that you integrally work with all the time. However, I never pursued a specialization in trauma. We have become so knowledgeable about trauma just in the last 5 years, really. And I am not certified in trauma. I'm not an expert in trauma. We do have a person on this call who's a partner in our work, who is a specialist in trauma, and she has agreed. Sheila, if you would put your contact information in the chat room, you are welcome to chat with Sheila personally during the course of the presentation, but Sheila has also agreed to stay on afterwards if you have more specific questions around trauma and the impact of trauma in your life. So she's here as my support during this presentation, and your support as well. So that's my first introduction to trauma. My second introduction to trauma came in my work, because for those of you who know me, I've been in the leadership development field since 1990, and taking what I learned about families and adapting it into organizations. We obviously don't do quote unquote real trauma work with these corporations, but you can't work in the leadership development field and not feel the impact of people's trauma from their past, from their present. So it's just when you're working at the level that I'm working at and making leadership very personal and connecting with people, people that may have been abused by someone in authority in their life. Well, that's going to impact their work in their company. If you've been abused by somebody in an authority figure, you're already going to be cautious when you're working inherently. Can be cautious when you're working with somebody in authority. So when we talk about psychological safety and creating a safe place, how you have been raised and the impact and the choices that you've made growing up and how you've been impacted by people in your life growing up impacts the way that you interact and the way that you lead. So we're going to get into that. So that was the other area. The other thing that I want to say is that I've been on a board for the last 18 months of an organization called Wayfinders Wellness Society. And we are an organization that serves first responders and military and their families who have experienced psychological injury in their work. So people who have been traumatized by their work. And so it's been raising, these are incredible people. And this has raised my awareness of trauma, and it raised my focus of trauma. And what we have is a ranch west of Calgary, where first responders and military and their family can come out and be a part of a healing community. We don't offer therapy, but what we do is offer a safe place that people can come, and we have programs, we have a whole community. We have a beekeeping program, we have an equine program, we have a strong Indigenous program, and so anybody that might feel inclined to might need that service, that's available to you at no charge. And we are also, I want to put a little plug in, we're also looking for board members who are really willing and committed to giving some of their time. So if you have any interest to serve this amazing population, to serve those who have served us, please feel free to reach out to us and let us know. Okay, so that has been very, it's been putting my focus on trauma and what's the impact. This week I went to a 2-day workshop on military sexual trauma, people who experience sexual trauma while they're in service in the military. And it's just such an eye-opener for me. 4.8%, and these are people who serve in our military have experienced sexual trauma in their work in the military. And that doesn't account for all the people who don't report it. So this is a significant issue in our society and in our world. And I just happen to feel that you can't avoid this when you're a leader. So what this is not today, let me just say in the next hour, it's not about turning you into trauma therapists or turning our workplace into therapy groups. It's not about diagnosing, okay? You can get a degree in Google University on that one. It's not about, this is very complicated, complex work. And I'm not here to give you prescribed overly simplistic or heavy-handed remedies for trauma. I treat this work very seriously. And so this is what you can expect, okay? You can expect, we're going to explore what is trauma? How does it impact people? If you're a positional leader, why care about this? Why is it important to even bother with this if you're a positional leader? We're going to increase your self-awareness and your ability to connect with people. We're going to create courageous and psychologically safe organizations. That's my work. And we're going to talk about what's the responsibility of every employee and what's the responsibility of positional leaders in the context of this world of trauma. And we're also just going to start some conversations that I hope that you will continue to have with the people in your life, okay? I want to start with some statistics here. 30% of women. And by the way, I also want to say, if I say anything today, we're going to have a variety of people on this call, mostly in the context of positional leaders. But if anything I say that triggers you, that you have difficulty with in any way, the nice thing about technology, you can just shut this thing down and you can turn me off, no problem. Or you can take a deep breath and just hang in there with me. It's totally up to you. I have a great deal of respect. You take care of yourself during this presentation. Very important, because I don't know what potentially, I will do the best I can not to create triggering conversations, but I can't guarantee that that won't happen for some of us. So let me give you some statistics. 30% of women, 20% of men have been sexually abused sometime in their lifetime. 25% of us have been beaten by a parent severe enough to leave a mark. 35% of couples engage in physical violence. 25% of us grew up in unpredictable and volatile homes, mostly fueled by alcohol. And this doesn't begin to touch on the numbers of us who experience childhood emotional abuse and neglect, or the people who go through personal loss, tragedy, and devastation. Just the pandemic itself was traumatic for many of us. So these are, I'm asking you, we're going to start to shine a light on this notion that it may not have felt traumatic to you, and then begin to realize, you know what, this had a greater impact on me than I realized. You can't live in this world with these kind of statistics, and some people say that these statistics are very conservative, but you can't live in this kind of a world and be naive to the fact that that doesn't impact building trust in an organization. It doesn't, it impacts. You cannot not impact the fact that you want to create a psychologically safe organization. These statistics are going to impact, the result of these statistics are going to impact us all, okay? So if you're a positional leader, why care? Why should this matter to us? And I hate to use the word should, but if you're in a positional leader, why care? So first of all, feelings that people bring to work matter. You can't just say, well, we just have a job to do here. If you're in a position of leadership, you have a responsibility to care. And if you don't care about people's feelings, and I have met leaders over the years who say feelings don't matter. Well, they do matter. It doesn't matter whether you like me or not. Well, you know what? It does matter. You don't lead in order to be liked. But if people don't like you, they will not trust you. They will not engage with you. And so feelings matter. And what people bring to work matters. And if you don't care about that, what I tell leaders is do yourself and your organization a favor and get out of management. You don't belong here. If you don't care about people's feelings, you can find another place in an organization, perhaps, where you can be an individual contributor, but don't serve as a positional leader. If people are strong individual contributors, and you want to give them a raise for bringing value to the organization, let's create a system where people can stay being individual contributors. Don't pursue leadership just to get a raise, and just don't promote people just because you're a strong individual contributor that don't care about people's feelings. You have to care if you are in leadership today. People come with a varieties of abilities to regulate their emotions, and people's emotions impact the way they work. So you have to be skilled, reasonably skilled, at helping people regulate their feelings. Now, again, we're going to talk about the responsibility of the leader and responsibility of all of us in terms of regulating our emotions. Trauma, past and present, impacts our daily functioning. Whether we're aware of it or not, you can't be naive to this. It impacts us. And then finally, trauma can influence our relationship with authority figures. I've mentioned this before, that if you've had abuse by an authority figure, that's going to impact the way that you trust your positional leaders inside of an organization. So let's start with a definition of trauma. This is a definition. It's not the definition. It's my definition of trauma. And again, you might come up with your own definition if you've done some of your own personal work through this. And I'd love to talk with Sheila, because Sheila and I have never really sat down and looked at, compared my definition with hers. But here's my definition of trauma. It's an uninvited intrusion on your personal space without your ability to stop it. That's my definition. Now, it could be the nice thing about my definition, I'd like to think the good thing about my definition is you can define what intrusion means to you. You can define for yourself what personal space means to you, and you can define what whether you have the ability to stop that or not. This is totally personal. You cannot describe or diagnose anybody else's trauma. This is a very personal decision. And it's hard to do this on our own. And we're going to talk about finding a guide in your life to support you with this. So it can be a physical trauma, like you're driving along in the car and somebody T-bones you and you smash your head against a window. That's physical trauma. And the interesting thing about the brain is so complex. And we're learning more and more and more. And I'll give you some of what I've learned about the neuroscience research neuroscience research from a very simplistic perspective. But we know it's complicated. So in theory, the brain really can't understand the difference between physical trauma, where you've had a blunt blow to the brain, and an emotional trauma where someone interferes in your space and violates the space that you live in. And so trauma has a very wide application in terms of my definition. It also, what's traumatic for one person may not necessarily be traumatic for another person. It's not, as we say, what happens to you, it's the impact of what happens to you. So for example, if somebody came after me with a knife, that would be traumatic for me because I wouldn't know how to stop it per se. I mean, I might try, but if I can't stop it, that's going to be traumatic for me because I don't have the ability. When you're a child and you're 3 feet tall and an adult is twice the size of you, you can't physically stop trauma from happening. Now, my son-in-law, by the way, I have a little side story here. My daughter's getting married in 2 weeks. But I have an amazing son-in-law, future son-in-law, soon to be son-in-law. I consider him part of our family. Great guy. But his job is that he trains law enforcement officers how to immobilize people without hurting them, how to restrain them, how to stop them. So if you came after Sean with a knife, it would not be traumatic to him because he has the ability to stop it. So it's not traumatic. It's that inability that creates some trauma in our life. Now, trauma, as we say, is not what happens to us. It's about the meaning that we make and the impact of the experience that it has on us or had on us. So let me drill in a little bit deeply, and I'm going to share with you my own experience with this. And for those of you who have heard me talk, you know that I have had wonderful, wonderful parents who gave me a beautiful upbringing. They were encouraging. They gave me support. They gave me a great deal of love 90% of the time. But there was this 10%, as we all have, a dark side in our family. Let me tell you, my mother grew up with a severely abusive father in an abusive, traumatic family, where one of her brothers was disciplined at the age of 2 by a nanny that came into the home because her mother had to go and look after her health, had to move away in the winter, and this nanny locked a 2-year-old in the closet, and severely an abusive father. My mother also lost her first husband in the war, very traumatic for her, and she had a stillborn baby 18 months after I was born. Now, those are 3 examples of trauma in her own life that she did not ever have the support to deal with and to heal from. And that came into our family in the form of rage, unpredictable rage. And when my mother lost it, you were afraid for your life. So and the interesting thing, that 10% is you never knew when that 10% was going to happen. So I lived my constant childhood and into my adult life in a continual stress response, in a continual state of activation. I had no idea how anxious I was until it began to become destructive in my life. And that anxiety was as we say, all responses to trauma always start off positive. They're a coping mechanism to protect you. But if they exceed their function, they become destructive. So what I developed is, and then the other side is, my dad was a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful human being who gave me lots of love, but he struggled with his own mental health. and he was hospitalized for manic depression on at least a half a dozen cases. And I never knew when he was going to lose touch with some reality and whether he went into a clinical depression or whether he got very manic, it was unpredictable. And so what my response was, and this is what I want to get into, is the impact that had on me, both physiologically and psychologically. One of the impacts is that I lived in this constant state of anxiety, and I have an oversensitive nervous system. And there's, as I say, the impact of that trauma is both a blessing and it's a curse, because the blessing is that I'm a very good therapist. I can tune into people's feelings. I can connect with people. The curse is I take the world's problems on, and that oversensitivity makes me very volatile and makes me very extreme in terms of what happens to my emotions. And I've had to learn to deal with the curse of that, but it comes in the same package. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So this is some of the trauma that I experienced in growing up, because this unpredictable volatility. It was like growing up in an alcoholic home, except we grew up in a very strong religion where there was no alcohol in our home. But it was like how alcoholics described living in an alcoholic family. So there's the impact is what we're talking about here. The impact on me, physiological, and there's a psychological impact. And those two are very interconnected. So what I want to do is that I want to break it down and be instructive in terms of the impact of trauma. So first of all, I want to help understand your brain is your friend. It's there to protect you. You would not be alive today had your brain not actively it's working on your behalf to keep you alive. And the brain, for example, if you're going for a walk and you see a stick, your brain will automatically say, better to call that stick a snake and be wrong than to call it a snake and be right. So than to call it a stick when it's really a snake. I think that if you can get my metaphor there. So your brain will always err on the side of caution because it's there to protect you. And it's really important. I want you to, if you get nothing from this, I want you to make friends with your brain and know that anything that happens, no matter what reaction that you have that might look negative, a reaction that's going on in the workplace that might create negativity in the workplace, it's coming from a place of protection. It is always starting from a place of protection. Challenge is it starts with protection, but when it over exceeds its function, maybe it doesn't realize that it needs to protect. It doesn't need to protect at this moment. At the time, it stems from needing to protect, but now it doesn't. I can give you a very clear example of this. I'm married to a very amazing woman who in 35 years that we've been together, she has, if you can believe this, never lost her temper to my awareness. I can't remember a time that Val has ever lost her temper. But Val will get up in the morning and she'll be making coffee, and I'll look over and she'll have this look on her eyes that's so similar to what my mother looked like. And I'll immediately go into an 8-year-old state, and I'll get this activation state where I get nervous, and I'll ask her, Val, are you angry about something? And she'll look over very surprised, inevitably, and say, no, I'm waking up. I haven't had my coffee yet. I'm just getting into the world. Oh, good. Then I can relax. And I have to, it's what we call a blur back. Now there's flashbacks and there's blur backs. And this is what it's manageable because it's what we call a blur back. But I have to, now a flashback would take me right out and it would just immobilize me. And that's where people who have trauma, this is an indicator, but I'm getting ahead of myself. But I have to manage this. So I just notice when this comes up and I have to be very attentive. Otherwise, I could start a fight to protect myself. I could start an argument. What are you so mad about? And then I can create a fight that wasn't even there to begin with, just out of, and again, it stems from protection. It's triggered, activated protection. So let's talk about protection. There's two ways that we can protect. We can protect psychologically and we can protect physiologically and psychologically. So let's talk about the physiological protection. If you can watch this graph, this is going to be fairly new for you. Anybody that studied this, it won't be new for you, rather. It'll be fairly familiar to you if you've studied it all about the stress response. So we have safety on one end, we have time on the other. The basic state of our physiologically is meant to be relaxed. We are hardwired to be relaxed. That is in essence what we're meant to be, is operating in the world from a relaxed place. And I always say to leaders, you have a responsibility to find that state, that as we call parasympathetic nervous system. You have a responsibility to come to work in a relaxed state. That is part of our responsibility as leaders. Because if you don't come to work in a relaxed state and know what that means, that is going to impact people in your workplace. And you're going to hurt people in essence if you don't come from a relaxed place. And we're going to talk about how you get there. But the most important thing, if you, again, get nothing else out of this presentation, is how do you access your parasympathetic nervous system, your relaxation? Because everything in the world will change once you are relaxed. And it's a skill, it's a muscle that needs to be developed. Now, I want to share with you what happens. So last fall, this is the conservancy. We live on the edge of a nature conservancy. It's privately owned nature conservancy, 200 acres. And I'm walking one morning, relaxed, walking through the woods with my two dogs. And true story, what happens is a bear is running toward me. Now, I will show you the picture of that bear. I didn't get a picture of him running toward me, but I got a picture of him after. He ran within probably, my memory is very hard at this point because you don't remember very well when you're in an activated stress response. But I'm going to suggest probably within 10 meters, that bear came and he ran. He was a very friendly guy, but he was just scared. These dogs were chasing him. And he ran right past me and ran up and crawled up a tree. Now, it took me, that is what's called an activated stress response. Now, that's an activation point, as we call it, a perceived threat. Now, what happens during that time is, as we know, a fight, flight, or freeze response. Cortisol is released, heart rate increases, pupil dilate, bronchial tubes dilate, digestion inhibited, bladder relaxes, liver. These are all indicators of what happens when you get activated. Now, what's the purpose of this? The purpose is to protect you, to either protect you from the bear, to freeze. In my case, I just froze, to take flight, because you know you're not going to outrun a bear and you're not going to outfight a bear, so you end up just freezing. But this is was a very activated response. Now, the body is designed to resolve itself, and once the threat is gone, then you go back to a relaxed state. That's the way it's meant to be. And it took me 5 minutes of breathing to get me back to a relaxed enough state to realize I'm actually safe. And I got those dogs out of the way. And we've actually come a few encounters with that same bear before he hibernated in the winter, and found that this bear is very friendly, but we just try to stay out of his way so that we don't intrude in his space. But that's what's meant to be a relaxed state, so that we stay in a relaxed state. That's the way that human physiology is designed for. But what happens, folks, in trauma is that what happens if we stay in that anxious place? If you've lived in trauma and you never know when the next one's going to hit, you stay anxious without realizing it. So what you do is you get a whole different set of symptoms when you get all those stress responses that stay in your body instead of coming down to a relaxed state. And, very few of us, when we were traumatized as children or traumatized as adults, do we get the support in that very moment to bring us back to a relaxed state through a process of support. So what we do is that we end up getting a whole different set of symptoms: continuous expression of stress hormones, restlessness, wound up on edge, difficulty concentrating, irritability, impatience, tension, micromanaging, controlling. These folks often make CEOs, and they take their anxiety and they put it into what we call productivity. And again, it has a good side to it, but look at what happens in the process of building a company. Sometimes you can just walk all over people. And then you get physical symptoms and you have prolonged sleep issues that come as a result of this constant anxiety. Bessel van der Kolk says it this way: trauma interferes with the brain circuits that involve focusing, flexibility, and being able to stay in emotional control. A constant sense of danger and helplessness promotes the continual secretion of stress hormones, which wreaks havoc with the immune system and the functioning of the body's organs. So this is the physiological impact of trauma. Now we have the psychological impact of trauma. Now, again, can you really separate psychology from physiology? One would argue not, but I'm going to break them down to help explain the psychological. This is where we get into meaning. Our brains are meaning-making organisms, and we create meaning in order to survive. Now, again, it just makes our life simple that we're continually making meaning. So when you drive your car, you learn to drive, you have to do it very slowly and methodically, and you walk through that, drive yourself very slowly. And then eventually your brain gets into patterns, your brain circuiting gets into patterns so that you begin to know automatically. The meaning means when you come up to a stop sign, there's cars coming, and the meaning says you put your foot on the brake. And so that we create meaning, just like with me. The meaning became, I have to stop, try to, the meaning for me in being raised in high traumatic, unpredictable, volatile family, the meaning for me that came to me was I have to take care of people. I have to take care of people in order to feel safe. And so if there are people in my family that don't look happy, I'm not safe. So I'm going to do whatever I can to please them in order to feel safe. And so this, again, originated from a protective response. It's a coping mechanism. But what if every time I see somebody unhappy on my team, I have to make them happy in order to feel safe? This is called parenting today. If you've been traumatized as a parent, or if you've been traumatized in your own life and you have children and you have the same meaning that I have to make my kids happy in order for me to feel safe. They have to like me. And so what we end up doing is pleasing our kids. That impacts your parenting. This is why self-awareness around our own trauma becomes critical, because the meaning that we made always originates from something positive, and it can, but if it overexceeds its function, it will get in your way and become destructive. Now, there's two primary, and I'm going to oversimplify this, but there's two primary ways that the brain makes meaning when we've been traumatized. You either become prey or you become a predator. So the prey component means you internalize the trauma. I'm much more of a prey animal. Part of it is my physiology. Part of it is my genetic makeup. Part of it is what I grew up with, is that I lend myself to being a prey animal, which means I'm going to be on guard. I'm going to be attentive to all of the emotions in the family. That's how I protect myself, by being extra attentive. And that's why, you know, it's interesting. We have horses and bees on our at our ranch out at Wayfinders, because prey animals will teach us a great deal, because horses, for example, live their life afraid of. So what happens is they connect very easily. So again, by internalizing that, has a good side, but the trap side is I'm oversensitive and I'm overactivated, and it just comes with the territory, and I have to learn to work with it. We'll get to that in a minute. The other meaning is that we become a predator, and that is you externalize it, and you become that. Those are the bullies on the playground. They're the predators that come into our workplace and hurt people. They abuse people because of their own, you know, as we say, violence is what happens when we don't know what to do with our suffering. So they externalize the trauma. If you don't acknowledge that trauma, you can be very hurtful to others. Prey animals are more hurtful to themselves. Predators are more hurtful to others, although you can't make that delineation, because ultimately, if you're there to please people, you'll hurt people through a variety of ways. Even I know what it's like to, because I'm immediately attracted to a relationship. I get into a working relationship, and then I'll exit that relationship just as quickly. And I can hurt people by not being able to have good, clear boundaries. Anyway, those are that's the psychological. We can have an overly sensitive nervous system, or you have an insensitive nervous system. You just block out and are insensitive to people's feelings. And we get lots of people in leadership roles in this predator mentality. And it's usually unconscious, although some predators can do it deliberately. Many will do it deliberately. But oftentimes we just don't know why I don't care about because you block out the feelings. And it's a way of, again, it originated from a positive place. It originated from a survival place. But then if it overextends its purpose, it will become destructive. So let's now, for the last 25 minutes here, talk about the responsibility of every employee in relation to this. Let's bring it back to the workplace. What's the responsibility of every employee, and what's the responsibility of positional leaders? And I want to start with personal responsibility. Be curious, speak up, understand activation and grounding, engage in your own healing, create a strength building system, and fulfill your job requirements. I'm going to start with number 6. The bottom line, folks, you can't use trauma as a way of getting out of work. You can't use trauma as an excuse for less work. Okay? We'll just start right off the bat there. This is not about feeling sorry for people, but I'm getting into my leadership role a little bit. So let's talk about, first of all, be curious. You got to care about people. You got to care. You got to be curious about this whole thing. Be curious about, how much is my trauma impacting my life? You might not see, you might be in a state. I lived years in a state of anxiety. It's when I was running, I could run 6-minute mile marathons, and I couldn't sit still in my 30s for 6 minutes because I was just, my trauma got transferred into a positive. Now, it was a positive addiction, but I couldn't sit still because I was too anxious to have any kind of, I couldn't meditate. I couldn't sit still. Now, part of that, again, is my temperament. And then you bring that temperament into a traumatic relationship, and you got a person who can't relax very well. So one of the ways that we can do this is a feeling wheel. And I actually meant to put this into the positional leadership, but you can use this in your team. Start your meetings with a feeling wheel. How are people feeling? Care about people's feelings. How are you feeling today? And just have a 1-word or a 1-sentence statement about how people are feeling. You can do this virtually. How are you feeling today? Now, if someone says, if they're in the red part, say, you know what, I'm a bit skeptical today, or I'm irritable today, or I'm not having a very good day. Okay. Then you can say, would you like to take 5 minutes and just explore that with the team? And if they say, no, I'm good with it, then check in with them later. But do a little check, care enough. And again, positional leaders need to do this, but we all can take responsibility to connect with our feelings and to connect with each other, just to get a sense of how we're feeling. We had a board retreat last week, and it's very easy to just get into the operations and the transactions of the board. We always start off by just doing a check-in, a temperature read. How are you doing? And we need to be curious about this. Now, if you say, I don't care about these feelings, we got a job to do, that can be a coping mechanism that you might be avoiding looking at some trauma in your life if you're not curious. Curiosity means that you're being vulnerable, to being open to learn about yourself. Be open to learn about, how is my behavior impacting you? And you can do this with a marriage partner. Do you find me sometimes difficult to live with? Is it tense? Do you feel in any way that it's not safe to be around me? Now, you're not going to have these conversations when you're activated, but when you're in a relaxed state, allow yourself to do this. Now, if you don't have any interest in being curious and you're not open, that can be a response to the fact that you're still living with some anxiety. Okay. Number 2, speak up. Speak up. I learned this. I just added this to my slides as a result of going through the workshop this week with military sexual trauma. And what we learn is that sexual trauma doesn't happen in isolation generally. There's a buildup, there's a strategy, and it starts with disrespectful comments in the workplace. Let me tell you, folks, we have enough trauma in our life that we should not be experiencing trauma in our workplace. Our workplace needs to be a place of safety, and our work and our families need to be a place of safety. And if ever you feel that someone is speaking disrespectfully, is being bullied, is being disrespected, or being dismissed, everyone has a responsibility to speak up. We say in bullying, there's three things. There's a bully, there's the person being bullied, and there's the bystander. And the bystander, bullies would not survive on the playground if 5 kids in that environment would speak up and say, it's not acceptable here. And we have to reinforce the fact and absolutely promote and support the courage to speak up when you see things being any comment, subtle or direct comment. Listen to your own intuition. And if it doesn't feel right to you, if people are behaving in a way that's contrary to what the espoused values are in that organization in any way, we need to have the courage to speak up. Number 3 is to understand activation and grounding. And I'm going to go through this very quickly. We have 2 states, and this comes back to my activation. We have the F state, which is fight, flight, freeze, or freaking out. And there's also another state called fawning, which is a state that I use, that I learned, which is to take care of when you're in a place of the F state, in a sympathetic response. We all need to find a way to access the C state, which is calm, cool, collected, and caring. The F state is going to happen to us. We are going to get activated, but we need to have a process, intentional process for moving into the C state. And the key thing is you're going to be in the F state. We're going to get into the F state, but you cannot lead and you can't come to work. We all have a responsibility to come to work, or it is in the C state. Or if we get activated in the F state, we have a responsibility to step back and move ourselves into the C state. So my way of teaching this is to go back to Pavlov. I think we're all familiar with the Pavlov's dog, that the Pavlov, the Russian scientist, would hold out the piece of meat and a dog would salivate. And then he rang the bell at the same time that he held out the meat. And then you trained the dog that all you needed to do was ring the bell and the dog would salivate. It's a stimulus response. But we're not dogs, folks. We have a brain that has hopefully evolved further than a canine, which means that we have a space between a stimulus and response. That just because you have an impulse to get angry doesn't mean that you have to act on that impulse. The analogy that I use, if you've got kids in a car seat and your kids are disturbed and they're distressed, you stop the car, you nurture them, you take them out of the car seat, you take care of them, and then you put them back in the car seat when they're not activated and they're in a relaxed state. What you don't do is put the kids in the car seat, in the driver's seat, right? You don't let your emotions run your life. That's canine mentality. And we are human beings that have the capacity to have a space. And that space is where you ground yourself. And we all need a process for grounding ourselves when you're activated. You have to take responsibility for your own activation. Okay? Access the parasympathetic and connect to the present moment. We all have. Now, I'm going to offer to you, it's adapted from Tara Brach. This is my process from going from the F state to the C state. We all have to find our own process. And if we had an in-person session here where we're actually doing a leadership program, what we would do is have people pair up. And it's a great exercise with your team. Go back to your team and have a conversation about, hey, what's your process from going from the F state to the C state? The F state is not a bad state. It's just a destructive state if you stay there, because it's activated to protect us. But if we stay there, it will become destructive. So you recognize it. I'm in the F state. And we have a language in our team that if anybody is activated, we can say, you're in the F state, take a break. This is a risk. You got to create a safe place, because when you're activated, You don't like to hear that you're activated. It tends to activate you some more. So you have to really have an accountability system to say you can recognize it, at least within yourself. Awareness in the body. Where is this happening? Where am I feeling it in my body? Is it in my chest? Is it in my stomach? Is it in my shoulders? It is in my back. Be aware in the body of where that is being activated. Step back and investigate it for 5 minutes. And maybe you have to put the meeting on. I mean, the thing is you can't, if you need to be in a meeting, you can't say, well, I'm activated, let's cancel the meeting. Now, you might have to say that, but you have to learn, and this takes coaching, but this is the responsibility of every one of us, that when we need to step back, maybe for 5 minutes, maybe for 10, and then come back and either debrief, or we say, you know what, I'll put it on hold. I'm too activated to talk about it right now. We'll talk about it tomorrow, or I'll bring it up later in our check-in. But I'm just going to suspend my emotions, and then let's put my emotions aside and get back to the work at hand. And we all need practice at learning the skills of doing that. You don't have to get into people's trauma. You don't have to talk about your trauma. You simply have to recognize that some things are going to activate you, and we have to deal with the present moment. This is a grounding exercise. And then ultimately we need, as we call, non-attachment, where we let it go. Okay? We have to engage in your own healing. If you don't transform your pain, you will transmit it to others. Okay? Now, we are not going to get into extensive healing and how you heal trauma, but let me just give you a few clues here. First of all, these are potential indicators of trauma. Now, I'm going to make it really clear. This is not a diagnosis. These are potential indicators. They're also indicators of other things besides trauma. But if you're experiencing these indicators, you might want to consider that maybe there's some trauma there that you have not recovered from and that you need some healing. You just bring some curiosity into it, a lack of curiosity. If you don't have any curiosity about this, if you're completely blocked, you wouldn't have sat through the presentation this long if you didn't have some degree of curiosity. But if you, this is a really good sign if you have curiosity. If you don't have any curiosity to learn about this, it's probably true that right now you may not be ready for it, and that's fine. But it often indicates if you're closed. See, we build barriers around ourselves to protect ourselves, and they're always protective barrier. They're always there to protect you. Again, it starts from a good intention, but that same barrier can block your openness to learn, and your openness to get feedback, and your openness to have self-awareness, because you're protecting yourself. So that's a potential difficulty regulating your emotions. So if you can go through in 5-10 minutes regulating your emotions, that takes skill. And if your emotions get out of whack and you're not regulating your emotions, that's often an indication of your trauma. Persistent physical symptoms, and again, doesn't guarantee that you have trauma, but your trauma will stay in your body. Okay? Persistent sleep disturbance, perfectionism, and over control. I know this one very well within myself. I expect the world to do it perfectly in order for me to feel safe. And it leads to over control of other people and over control of myself. And it's not relaxing because I got to do this thing perfectly in order to feel safe. Insensitivity, oversensitivity to others, need for power, control, or greed, entitlement and self-centeredness, and finally, an inability to access your passions. Now, what does passion have to do with this? If you put a wall around yourself to protect yourself from the trauma, you know what else you do is that you protect yourself from connecting to your joy and connect to your passion. I could put joy in there as well, an inability to access joy. That life isn't enjoyable because you're not relaxed, enjoying the present. You're out controlling the world in order to feel safe. So people often come to me when we talk about passion, when we get into the academy and I have people access, what's your passion in life? And people will come to me and say, I have no idea what my passion is. That is often, most cases, a response to trauma, because they block their trauma out so much that they stop accessing what really brings them joy and passion in their life. Okay. So this is about healing. Every parent, no matter how hard they try, will be both a blessing. And this is the wisdom of my mother. My hope is that my children will appreciate the blessing, if not immediately, then later in life. And perhaps more importantly, that they will take the curse and, like an oyster irritated by a grain of sand over time, use a catalyst to build layers of character and understanding, thus producing a pearl. So you could sit and reflect on that for hours. And what we're saying here is to take your pain and turn it into a pearl. That is healing trauma work. As we say in the trauma work, you got to look the dragon in the eye. Don't be afraid of the dark. You got to face the stuff. The very stuff that you're afraid to face is where your gold is. That's where you're healing. That's where your gifts are. When you can go through wherever you have been wounded, you will find your gifts. Now, I have the aspects from pain to pearls has to do with facing the anger. Forgiveness, I don't use the word forgiveness. I use the word letting go, because forgiveness can be very triggering for some people. If you're comfortable with the word forgiveness, no problem. But I use the word either letting go or forgiveness, whatever you're comfortable with. But you have to work with your own trauma to heal from it if you want to be free to really be in a relaxed place, which means this is not Sunday school platitude that you can just decide to forgive somebody overnight. This is looking at your anger, working with your grief, feeling your fear, examining the meaning that you got out of that. And then what emerges from that is compassion, gratitude, and wisdom. Okay? Bobby Kennedy, in 1968, the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated, came to Indianapolis, Indiana, and gave a presentation. And if you want to Google this, it's a 5-minute spontaneous presentation. He threw away his notes and he stood on the back of a flatbed truck. And the whole country had gone through trauma. And in Indianapolis, Indiana, because of this 5-minute speech, that whole community had less violence than the rest of the country. And it's a beautifully articulated, spontaneous speech. And in that speech, he quotes Aeschylus, the great dramatist. He who learns must suffer, and even in our sleep, pain that cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, and in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom to us by the awful grace of God. This is where your wisdom lies, is where you have been traumatized. This is where your wisdom lies, where you have been wounded. But you have to go and face all of those different aspects in order to capture it, from my experience. You don't have to do anything, by the way, but I have to be careful of my language. What we need in our nation is not division. What we need in our nation is not violence or lawlessness, but love and wisdom, compassion toward one another, and the feeling of justice toward those who still suffer. This is a man who knew his own trauma, and 63 days after this event, he himself was assassinated. This was a traumatic age to live in, the age of the 1960s, as we all have ages. And then finally, we need to create a strength building system for ourselves. We need to have some kind of a system, a mental health fitness, a mental fitness program. We have a physical fitness program, but I got to tell you, most of the reasons why I exercise today, I know I suffer from the same challenge that my dad did in terms of mood swings. And I've come to understand by facing my own trauma with this, that actually my depression is my greatest gift, because it's a monitor for my life that monitors when I get off my authentic self. But I have to have my own rigorous mental fitness program. The reason I exercise mostly is just for my own mental fitness more than anything. So we can create that within ourselves. And then finally, fulfill your job expectations. Don't let all of this stuff interfere from the fact that you got a job to do. Now, what I want to do and finish up in the next 5 minutes is talk about the responsibility of positional leaders. And again, be curious, care about people. I was reminded today by Stephanie about a philosophy that we use in our organization called love. Listen, understand, and validate. take time to just attend to people's emotion. You don't have to fix, you don't have to straighten them out, you don't have to therapize. We just simply have to feel comfortable enough with ourselves by working with our own background and trauma and past trauma so that we can hold the space to listen, understand, and validate. Speak up. They say in the military that the highest ranking person in the room will set the response of that person to a disrespectful comment will set the whole tone for the culture. And being still creates what we call unacknowledged acceptance. If you don't say anything as the highest ranking person in the room, if you don't speak up, it will be implied that it's acceptable. And you accept it without saying that you accept it if you don't speak up. And if you're in a position of leadership, it is imperative that you speak up if you see somebody violating the values in any way. Be intentional about creating psychological safety. I could give you a whole presentation on that. Some of you have heard my presentation on psychological safety. We delve much more deeply into that in the academy. But all I want to say is about psychological safety is psychological safety is not about being comfortable. It's being safe enough. And this is where safety makes it safe enough to work to be uncomfortable so that you create courageous organizations and because growth lies in the blue circle here. Safety isn't comfortable. Safety can be uncomfortable, but there's a red zone. And if you push people into a red zone, it's going to backfire. And if people don't feel safe, they're not going to grow and they won't engage the way you need them to. Be aware of people's ability to regulate emotions, okay? And approach regulation challenges one-on-one. If there's people on your team who are having difficulty regulating their emotions, take them aside one-on-one and listen to them, be curious, and really acknowledge, again, go through that same listen, understand, validate, and work with them and coach them at ways of grounding themselves when they're in meetings. How can I help support you to ground yourself so that your deregulation doesn't get in the way of our team? And then finally, don't compromise your expectations. You don't have to lower your standards just because people on your team have had trauma in their life. Your job is to help them get their job done. And that's actually good for trauma. If you've had some trauma in your life and you're having difficulty regulating your feelings, come to work and get to work. It can actually be helpful to be in an environment that will not compromise their expectations from you. Okay. The takeaways, this is what I want to leave you with. Be curious and care. That's L-U-L. Love, right? L-U-V. Take some time to reflect on your own traumas in your life. Start talking about the impact of trauma with people in your life. Articulate your own grounding process. Articulate your own healing process. I don't know that it's possible to get through life without some trauma in your life. And it's all a spectrum. On the spectrum that we deal with, the spectrum is all over it. It is all over the place. But look at even small traumas that you've had in your life, if you can call them small traumas. Don't diminish them, because what you might label as a small trauma might have much more impact on you than you realize. But articulate, how have you healed from that trauma? Speak up. Reach out for support. I don't believe you can do this. It's a lonely journey, folks, but you can't do it alone. We need to reach out for resources, therapists, if you need some help, outside support. Reach out to a coach, somebody that can help guide you. And certainly if you want to reach out to me, if something is stirred up here, you need to have any questions, feel free. Kristen will be extending all those links on the call in the chat room. And check out our, I can't get by here without, I want to be transparent with you that we want to give you some information on the Academy. I hope that you'll look into this. If you want to delve more deeply into this work, we have an in-person event through the University of Calgary and we have a virtual event. The early bird rate does expire next Tuesday. So if you want to get the early bird rate, those are your opportunities. Again, Kristen will give you that. I hope you'll join us. It's a safe community of people who really are committed to being authentic and to deepening this material. We spend the first half on leadership presence, about your purpose and centering and clarity and your character. We look deeply into, we'll delve deeply into your shadow side that we've talked about today in a safe environment. And we talk about in the second half is all about psychological safety, trust, accountability. These are the leadership practices and embracing change. We go through the hero's journey and then we integrate it. And if you're interested, you can get all of that material. Okay, I'll leave you one last slide, folks, which is the essence of all this. I always say after an academy to take some time to chill before you come back to reality, because it's a transformational experience. And we had one leader when I used to do these before the pandemic up in Banff who walked around Lake Minnewanka and said this: attached is a photo that symbolizes for me the role of an authentic leader. Fir is bent from the ongoing storms, but stands tall to hold the space where the aspen can grow. Folks, we've all been through some trauma in our life. My hope is that we can bring a little more humanity to our work and that we can stand tall so that we can hold the space for others to grow. His attentiveness and poetic response to this was quite astounding to me. And so hopefully my presentation today has created a little bit more humanity in our world. Thank you for listening in. And at this point, I'm going to turn off the recording